The dirt was still damp on my hands when the porch light flickered behind me, casting long shadows across the yard that didn't belong to anything alive. The night smelled like rain and turned soil, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the crickets. I remember thinking that grief does strange things to your senses, how it sharpens fear and dulls logic at the same time. If you've ever trusted the wrong person or felt your instincts screaming while your mind tried to stay calm, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this don't stay buried forever. I stood there frozen, replaying every moment I had ignored, every kindness that felt just a little too rehearsed, every warning I explained away because I was tired of hurting. Something had been taken from me, then hidden, and I was only beginning to understand why. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I believed the lie because I was already falling apart. 3 days after I buried my husband, a family member I trusted told me something else had been taken from me, and I didn't have the strength to fight it. My name is Margaret Hale, and at that moment, grief had hollowed me out so completely that I mistook calm words for truth. I was exhausted in a way sleep can't fix. The house felt too quiet. My thoughts moved slowly, and every decision felt heavier than it should have. When he explained what had happened, I remember nodding instead of questioning. Even as something inside me twisted, it was easier to accept the pain than to argue. Still, the story didn't sit right. It felt rushed, rehearsed, wrapped in concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. I told myself that doubt was just another cruel side effect of loss, that my instincts couldn't be trusted anymore. I wanted to believe him because believing meant I could stop thinking. But grief has a strange way of sharpening certain senses while dulling others. Late that night, standing alone in my kitchen, I felt an unease I couldn't explain, like something unfinished was pressing up from beneath the surface. I only knew something was wrong, and it wouldn't stay buried for long. I had lived a quiet, ordinary life before everything broke, and I took comfort in that ordinariness. I was in my early 60s, recently retired, still learning how to move through days that no longer revolved around my husband. Losing Paul after 40 years of marriage left a hollow space that routines tried and failed to fill. Our home outside Dayton had always felt steady to me. Same creaking floors, same morning light in the kitchen, same habits repeated until they became invisible. After the funeral, I clung to those habits. I woke up, made coffee, folded laundry that didn't need folding, and sat in rooms that felt too big. Grief dulled my edges. It slowed my thinking and softened my instincts. I wasn't reckless. I was tired. I wanted things to feel manageable again, even briefly. I wanted someone else to tell me what came next, because deciding on my own felt impossible. That exhaustion made me easier to reassure, easier to guide, easier to convince. Looking back, I can see how exposed I was, how badly I wanted normalcy to return. At the time, it just felt like surviving one quiet hour after another. When family began stopping by more often, offering help I hadn't asked for, I told myself it was kindness. I didn't yet understand how vulnerability invites attention, and how not all attention is safe. That lesson would come later, carried in small moments, uneasy silences, and the slow realization that someone was watching my grief far more closely than I knew at the time. I didn't question it at first when my nephew-in-law, Daniel, began showing up more often. After the funeral, he was suddenly everywhere, carrying groceries, mowing the lawn, fixing things I hadn't noticed were broken. He spoke gently, moved efficiently, and reminded me more than once that I didn't have to handle things alone. Part of me was grateful. In my fog, his presence felt like structure. He asked what I needed before I realized I needed anything. He took notes, made lists, offered to manage small decisions so I could rest. I told myself this was what family did when someone fell apart. Still, there were moments that unsettled me. He lingered longer than necessary. His questions went beyond concern and edged into inventory, as if he were quietly cataloging my routines. When he looked around my home, it felt less like curiosity and more like assessment. I brushed those thoughts away, embarrassed by my own suspicion. Grief makes you generous with explanations. I blamed my discomfort on nerves, on loneliness, on being unused to company. I reminded myself that kindness can feel awkward when you're not used to receiving it. What I didn't say out loud was how closely he watched everything, especially the one presence in my life that never left my side. While Daniel spoke softly and smiled, my companion reacted in a way I couldn't ignore, and contrast stayed with me after the door closed. I wasn't as alone as I thought during those weeks. Even when the house felt unbearably empty, my dog, Cooper, stayed close in a way that felt intentional, as if he understood something I didn't have words for yet. He followed me from room to room, settled at my feet while I stared into space, and slept beside the bed instead of his usual spot. Our days fell into a quiet rhythm, morning light, coffee cooling on the counter, his steady breathing nearby. When grief overwhelmed me, his presence anchored me to the moment. I talked to him without realizing it, letting thoughts spill out because he never needed answers. What I noticed, slowly, was how alert he became. His ears lifted at unfamiliar sounds. His eyes tracked movement I would have ignored. Around Daniel, his body changed. He stood taller, muscles tense, gaze fixed in a way that made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing, just protectiveness heightened by my emotions. Still, Cooper never relaxed when Daniel was near. After those visits, he paced the yard, circling the same stretch of ground as if drawn by a scent I couldn't detect. He scratched once, then again, returning to that spot with quiet determination. I didn't understand what he was reacting to. I only knew that while I was numbed by grief, Cooper seemed awake and focused. The garden was Daniel's idea, offered gently as a way to honor Paul and give me something living to tend. He spoke about peace and remembrance, and I agreed before really thinking. Watching him mark the ground behind the house, I felt grateful someone cared enough to plan for my grief. He arrived early each morning, digging deeper than I expected. Soil piled high beside neat trenches. Sometimes another man worked with him, quiet and unfamiliar. Their movements efficient and fast. I stayed inside, telling myself this was generosity, not intrusion. Still, details began to bother me. Daniel asked me to keep Cooper indoors while he worked, saying the dog distracted him. The request felt small, reasonable, yet it left my chest tight. Cooper sat by the door, ears forward, watching the digging continue. As the garden took shape, his control grew clearer. He smoothed soil obsessively, corrected my suggestions, and checked the ground the way someone checks a lock. I told myself grief was making me suspicious. I reminded myself to be thankful. Cooper disagreed. Each day his agitation increased, paws tearing at the same corner of earth, breath quick, body rigid. I tried to stop him, embarrassed by his persistence, unaware that he was closer to the truth than I was. The sight of him digging began to frighten me, not because of damage, but because it felt urgent, desperate, as if time were running out. Whatever lay beneath that garden was pulling him back again and again. I sensed a breaking point approaching, one I didn't understand yet, only that it would change everything for us all. I came home that afternoon expecting quiet, maybe a little dust from the garden work, nothing more. Instead, Daniel was waiting, his posture stiff, his hands wrapped in gauze. Before I could ask anything, I felt the weight of his urgency pressing down on me. He told me Cooper was gone, not lost, not hurt, but permanently taken away for my own safety. The words landed without sound, like something heavy dropped into deep water. I remember staring at his bandaged hand and feeling my mind detach, as if logic had stepped out of the room. Every part of me wanted to argue. Cooper had never shown aggression, never even growled at a stranger, but grief has a way of dulling instinct. I was already mourning so much that my heart simply made room for one more loss. I nodded because fighting felt impossible. Daniel explained it all with calm certainty, presenting a small container as proof that there was nothing left to hope for. I accepted it because disbelief required energy I no longer had. I let myself go numb, telling myself this was just how suffering stacked, one quiet blow after another. That night, the house felt wrong. No footsteps, no familiar presence beside me. Silence pressed in from every corner, and beneath the sorrow, something else lingered, sharp and unsettled. Daniel hadn't looked relieved. He had looked afraid. And that fear stayed with me long after he left. I sat there wondering how truth could feel heavier than grief, and why my chest wouldn't believe him fully. I moved through the days afterward like a guest in my own life. I fed myself, washed dishes, made the bed, all without feeling present. The house was too quiet, every room echoing with what was missing. I kept expecting Cooper's weight at my feet, the soft sound of him shifting in his sleep, and each time the silence answered instead. As numbness faded, questions crept in. I replayed Daniel's explanation again and again, noticing gaps I had ignored. His timing, his urgency, the way fear had tightened his face. None of it matched the calm finality he wanted me to accept. My eyes kept drifting toward the garden. The soil looked disturbed even after being smoothed over, darker in one corner, as if it had been turned too recently. I told myself grief was inventing patterns, yet I couldn't stop looking. Sleep refused to come. I lay awake listening to the house settle, my thoughts circling the same uneasy truth. Something about that day didn't belong, and no amount of reasoning could make it fit. Sometime after midnight, I gave up on rest and walked into the kitchen for water, noticing how still the night felt and how my body leaned toward the back of the house outside quietly. I was halfway through the kitchen when I heard it, a scraping sound from the backyard, sharp and frantic, nothing like wind or animals. My heart started pounding before my mind caught up. I moved toward the back door, every step slow, afraid of what I might see and afraid of what I might not. Under the porch light, the garden was alive with motion. Dirt flew from the far corner in quick bursts. A dark shape hunched low, working with desperate focus. For a breathless moment, I thought grief had finally broken me. Then the shape lifted its head. Cooper stood there, muddy, thinner, trembling, but unmistakably alive. The world tilted. Air rushed back into my lungs as shock gave way to something wild and aching. Relief crashed into anger so fast it hurt. He was here. He had never left. I crossed the yard on shaking legs and dropped beside him, pressing my hands into his fur to be sure he was real. He leaned into me once, then turned back to the ground, digging harder, as if this was why he had come back. I followed his lead, clawing at the soil with bare hands, breath ragged, fear replaced by urgency. Whatever had been buried here mattered more than questions. When my fingers struck something solid beneath the dirt, I understood this night wasn't just about his return. It was about what he needed me to uncover next. And for the first time since Paul died, I trusted my instincts without hesitation or fear holding me back. I dug until the metal edge showed, cold against my fingertips. We pulled together and lifted a sealed box from the earth, heavier than it should have been. When I opened it, the night sharpened. Inside were tightly wrapped packets, uniform and unmistakable. I didn't need expertise to know this was serious, illegal, and dangerous. Everything rearranged itself in my mind. The deep trenches, the insistence on keeping Cooper inside, the way Daniel watched the soil like a lock, the lie delivered with rehearsed calm. He hadn't been protecting me. He had been protecting what was buried. The motive was suddenly clear. Cooper wasn't a problem to be managed. He was a threat to a secret. His instincts had put him in the way, and erasing him would have erased the risk. That realization burned, steady and controlled, not loud but focused. I felt anger rise and settle into resolve. Confusion drained away, replaced by clarity that steadied my hands. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This was evidence, and it had nearly stayed hidden because I was tired and trusting. I closed the box and looked at Cooper, exhausted but unwavering. We had come too close to losing the truth. I knew then I couldn't carry this alone. The next step had to be careful, deliberate, and shared with someone who could help me do this the right way safely. I called Mark because he was the one person I trusted to hear me without dismissing what I'd found. He arrived quietly, took in the box, the disturbed soil, Cooper's shaking body, and listened without interrupting. For the first time since this began, I felt my chest loosen. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He didn't suggest grief had distorted my judgment. Instead, he nodded, thoughtful, and confirmed something I hadn't known until that moment. There had been concerns before, subtle ones, changes in behavior that raised questions long before the garden was ever planned. When he explained why Cooper reacted the way he did, everything settled into place. My companion hadn't been guessing. He had been trained, alert to exactly the kind of danger buried in my yard. That knowledge steadied me. I hadn't imagined any of it. Fear shifted into focus. Mark reminded me that truth matters most when it's handled carefully. Acting too fast would only protect the wrong person. By the time he left, we weren't just reacting anymore. We were thinking ahead. A plan was forming, deliberate, and I understood what came next fully. We didn't rush after that. Mark made it clear that truth only holds when it's undeniable, and that meant waiting. I hated that part. Waiting felt like inviting danger back into my home, but moving too fast would only warn Daniel. The plan itself was simple, almost painfully so. I would act as if nothing had changed. I would invite him back. Mention casually that the garden was being redone, that heavy equipment would arrive soon and dig deeper than before. Saying those words out loud felt like swallowing glass. Every instinct told me to confront him, to demand answers, to protect myself openly. Instead, I had to pretend. I cooked dinner. I kept my voice steady. I listened while my heart counted down. Fear followed me everywhere during those days. Each sound outside made me tense. Each knock made my pulse jump. But beneath the fear was something firmer than I expected. Resolve. Once the seed was planted, there was no pulling it back. If Daniel had buried something worth hiding, time would corner him. All I could do was watch, wait, and trust that the truth would surface on its own terms. By the time night fell, I knew the trap was set. All that remained was to stay awake and see who came to reclaim what they thought was still hidden. I barely breathed as darkness closed. I sat in the darkened bedroom, barely breathing, watching the backyard through a narrow gap in the curtains. The house was silent except for my own pulse, loud enough to feel in my ears, every minute stretched, each one daring me to give up. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., headlights slid across the fence and vanished. A shadow moved toward the garden, deliberate and hurried. My stomach dropped as recognition set in. The plan was working. Daniel dug fast, not careful anymore. I watched him unearth the box, check its contents, and shove it into a bag, and there was no hesitation, no confusion, only desperation. In that moment, any lingering doubt dissolved. The lights came on all at once. The night shattered into motion as officers closed in from every direction. Daniel ran, panic replacing control. But he didn't make it far. Cooper surged forward when released, precise and unwavering, ending the threat without chaos or cruelty. I stayed where I was, hands shaking, tears spilling without sound. Relief hit me so hard my knees weakened. Justice didn't arrive with shouting or speeches. It arrived with certainty. When it was over, the yard fell quiet again. The danger was contained. The secret was no longer mine to carry. As the last patrol car disappeared, I stepped back from the window, knowing the long night had finally ended, and a different kind of morning was waiting for us both at last. Morning came quietly after that night, softer than I expected. Sunlight returned to the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't flinch at every sound. The chaos had ended, even if my body hadn't fully caught up yet. The days that followed moved slowly, but they moved forward. I cleaned the house with intention this time, opening windows, letting stale air escape. The garden was left alone, covered, waiting. No longer something I feared looking at. That alone felt like progress. Cooper healed beside me. His energy returned in small ways. A longer walk, a deeper sleep, a steadier gaze. Each sign reminded me that safety isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply the absence of threat. I reached out to family I trusted and allowed myself to accept help again, carefully. Trust didn't rush back, but it began to rebuild, brick by brick, with honesty underneath. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like dust after a storm. And as life found its rhythm again, I understood that what remained mattered. It felt earned and grounding. I didn't come out of this the same person. I trust differently now. Not less, just wiser. I learned that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind kindness, routine, and good intentions. Waiting for grief to lower your guard. What changed me most was realizing how often my instincts tried to speak. They whispered through small discomforts, through patterns that didn't fit, through a companion who noticed what I couldn't. Listening sooner might have spared pain, but listening at all saved what mattered. I'm grateful for the protection that showed up quietly and stayed, for the people who believed me when it would have been easier to doubt. For the moment, courage outweighed fear, and truth was allowed back into my life. Healing didn't erase what happened, it gave it meaning. I carry the lesson gently now. Pay attention, ask questions, and honor the signals your body and heart send, especially when life feels fragile. If this story stirred something in you, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Sharing helps us feel less isolated, and connection is how we keep each other safe. Thank you for listening, and for holding space for stories that deserve patience, care, and courage.